So if we look at these statistics here, we can see that on some of the islands that were previously, well, Exuma had one or two settlements before the one or two planters before the Loyalists, but definitely there were a number of islands that had not been settled prior to the arrival of the Loyalists. And definitely, if you look at the white to black ratios, you see ratios that are very, very predominant as far as the African populations are concerned, because these were plantation islands. So the Loyalist slaves, they were primarily of Congo, Angolan, Senegambian, and Windward Coast ancestry. Windward, presently Liberia, and also sometimes in the histories included are Sierra Leone. The Loyalist slaves were 2/3 Creole and 1/3 African. These are the points of origin of the slaves that went to Carolina. The numbers actually indicate the number of, well, number one means that there were a lot of slaves that went to Carolina from Senegambia because of the rice planting, and the people in Senegambia had done a lot of rice planting, and therefore it was in the interest of the British planters in the Carolinas to obviously import slaves from that area, all right? Number two would be the Windward Coast, and number three would be the Congo. So, and we see 4 is Gold Coast, so it might seem as if, you know, like they're all over the place from the West African coast, but really and truly, you have like reinforcements of cultures as each migration comes in. Most of the cotton plantations were located on the out islands and were modest in size compared to the sugar plantations of Jamaica. Creighton points out few estates were grand, and only a handful of owners had more than 100 slaves, their plantation houses being far from palatial. On the larger islands such as Crooked, Exuma, and Long Island, an average of 3,000 to 4,000 acres of cotton were planted by approximately 1,000 slaves. The slaves that came along with the Loyalists actually spoke an English Creole that has been described, that has been named Gullah, G-U-L-L-A-H. In some cases, as far as the island settlement are concerned, in some cases, the owners lived on the islands year-round and were directly involved in supervising the planting of cotton. And in other cases, the owners were merchants in Nassau who appointed agents or overseers on the plantations. This, of course, makes a tremendous difference, you know, if you have like islands where there are predominantly Gullah-speaking slaves living without any influence from the English dialects that are spoken by the Loyalists, then you have a context in which the actual features of the Gullah language will be preserved to a much greater extent. If I could go on to the summary slide of the second language migration, I think this is the one that Dr. Saunders might be looking, where am I going on this one? But, oh yeah, I jumped back, sorry. This is a migration that took place between 1788 and 1807. This is from Wilkie and Farnsworth texts, and they get their data from D. Eltis. So you have a total of 9,560 slaves, more than half of whom came from the Bight of Biafra. This is the Bight of Biafra slaves would be a new input into the language system. And then you have West Central Africa, all right, and we've already, I mean, the Loyalist slaves already have some West Central Africa. Congo is a very big influence in the Loyalist plantation system. And finally, you have the next largest group. Oh, I said it the other way around. Sorry, and Sierra Leone would be the second largest group. Sierra Leone and Senegambia have languages, or the primary language is called Fula, and they therefore are reinforcing, remember we said that some of the Loyalist slaves came from Senegambia, so these are not all new linguistic influences coming into the island. So I guess we need to ask the question, why or how is it that the histories do not actually show these slaves? And I do have some ideas about what took place, but at this time I'll just stick to the history. By 1800, Nassau had become an entrepot for the slave trade, so undoubtedly some of these slaves were resold to St. Augustine, Savannah, and Havana, according to Wilkie and Farnsworth. But the slave population on some Loyalist islands doubled. The table shows an increase in the slave population of 5,500, all right? And while I can concede that some of this is going to be natural birth, I believe that we might have, you know, an answer to what happened to a good half of the 9,000 slaves that arrived in the Bahamas during this period. So I want to talk about the language dynamics on the out islands. The language dynamics is becoming obviously very complex. You've got the Gullah spoken by the Loyalist slaves. They are pretty well established by this time. And therefore, what we see is a merge between African speakers of Fula, Bantu, and Biafran languages engage in their new communities in the second language acquisition of Gullah, of the Loyalist slaves. It is not so much the restructuring of a new Creole that took place as the acquisition of a second language, given that this contact situation is very different than the colonial slave contact situation. The acquisition of a second language was possibly easier because they were both slaves, that is the Loyalist slaves, and these newcomers that I'm talking about, they are equal in number in some cases, which means easy access to the Gullah Creole English. The Loyalist slaves may have more prestige because they speak the target language, but they do not have more power since they are all enslaved. The common ancestry of Congo, Angola, and Senegambian shared by some members of these two groups of people would motivate higher levels of transmission from African languages of the newcomers in the acquisition of the Creole. This is a contact situation where the languages spoken have equal value and plentiful exposure one to the other. Very, very different to the English and the African contact situation. Thus, the new variation of Gullah acquired by the new arrivals might be more Africanized. Reverend Rose, an English missionary of the time, remarked in the 1790s that many of the Exumer blacks were followers of Muhammad, which suggests Senegambian influence since this region was strongly influenced by Islam. After the failure of the cotton and the departure of the Loyalist masters, the majority of the out island slaves remained, and these conditions of isolation fostered the preservation of the Gullah influence BCE on the central and southern islands. The impact of the Loyalist migration to New Providence was notably different to that on the islands. Nassau society was transformed economically, politically, and socially with the introduction of a class of merchants and professional elites from the American colonies who looked at the old inhabitants, referred to as conchs, in a pejorative way, I'm sure, as uneducated and uncultured.